In this video, I'm going to be grading every NBA draft class since 2000. And there are a lot of different things that go into this. It's pretty self-explanatory though. You got how many good players were there, how many all-stars, did they produce any MVPs, who was the first overall pick, who was the best player, the depth of the class, a bunch of different things that I will look at in this video. I hope you guys enjoy it because I haven't done a lot of NBA videos lately, but now the NBA finals are here. I figured I might as well give you guys an NBA video. So let's begin. The 2000 NBA draft is widely considered one of the worst draft classes of all time, and it's not hard to see why, as there were only 3 all-star players, there were no MVPs. First overall pick was Kenyon Martin, who had a solid, not great career, made an all-star team, but was really a second or third option. The best player in the class, in my opinion, was Michael Redd, who had an injury-shortened career. There were some other good players. Hedo Turkoglu had some good years, Mike Miller had some good years, Jamal Crawford had a long, if not inefficient career. Jamal Magloire somehow sneaked out an all-star appearance as well. In case you guys don't know, that's what the highlighted players are. Overall, this class had 0 superstars, which is pretty rare and pretty hard to do. So I'm gonna have to give it a D-. The 2001 NBA draft might be most remembered for the first overall pick, which was Kwame Brown, thanks to Michael Jordan's incredible eye for talent. Kwame was the first high school player ever selected first overall and ended up becoming one of the biggest draft busts in NBA history. But that doesn't mean the rest of the class was as bad. In fact, there were several Hall of Famers and 8 all-star players selected in total. To me, the best player in the draft was between Pau Gasol and famous teammate respecter Tony Parker, but I went with Pau Gasol as the best player. You also had a guy like Tyson Chandler, who had a very long career, even though he never developed any post moves. Joe Johnson, Zach Randolph, Gerald Wallace, Shane Battier was a contributor for a couple championship teams. Jason Richardson, Mehmet Okur. Gilbert Arenas had 3 years. He was one of the best players in the league. So this class had a lot of good players. No MVPs, but still a lot of good players. I would have to give it a grade of a B+. 2002 NBA draft will always be remembered as the Yao Ming draft, and Yao Ming, when he was healthy, was worth the hype, or at least close to it. Unfortunately, Yao Ming had a bunch of injuries and his career was shortened. There were 4 all-star players in total in this draft, and the best player in the draft was seriously close between Amari Stoudemire and Ming, but I went with Amari because I felt like he had somewhat more playoff success than Yao did, even before the injuries. Not a lot of depth to this class. Amari's a big name. Carlos Boozer is a big name, obviously Yao. Caron Butler was a good player. Tayshaun Prince was a key part for those Pistons teams in the 2000s, but not a lot of game changers in this class. This is why I'm gonna have to say it's a C- grade. The 2003 NBA draft is one of the best draft classes of all time, partly because it has the best player of all time, LeBron James, who was the first overall pick. We all know about LeBron, and I'm sure a lot of you are going to be crying in the comments that I called LeBron the GOAT. Get over it, he is. Anyway, the 2003 class had 9 all-star players, a 4-time MVP winner, and a couple finals MVPs. For most other draft classes, guys like Carmelo, Wade, and Bosh would be the best players, but in this draft class, they are fighting for second best. David West was also really good. Kyle Korver is one of the best shooters of all time. Mo Williams was a respectable player. Josh Howard had his moment in the sun. Obviously, the best player is LeBron, but this class also had a lot of depth and a lot of players who had very successful long careers, so I'm gonna have to give it a grade of A+. 2004 NBA draft wasn't quite as good as 2003. Not a lot of drafts are, but it was still pretty good. Dwight Howard was the first overall pick to the Magic. He was also the best player in the draft. It also saw Andre Iguodala, Luol Deng, a guy like Al Jefferson, who never made an all-star team but was famous for his low post moves. Devin Harris and Jameer Nelson had some good years. Josh Smith had a respectable career despite the fact that he was known as one of the worst shot decision havers ever. Kevin Martin had some good years as well, so there were a lot of good players in the 04 draft. 5 all-stars in total. There were no MVPs, but there was a finals MVP with an asterisk. That asterisk belongs to Andre Iguodala and his inflated biceps for the 2015 finals MVP. That belongs to LeBron James, not Steph Curry. I will die on that hill. Either way, 2004 draft, good draft. I give it a solid grade of B. 2005 draft was another interesting one. There was one all-time great player in Chris Paul. You had Deron Williams, who was one of the best point guards in the league for a couple years, and then mysteriously kind of dropped off for his prime. Danny Granger had some good years. Andrew Bynum, who can forget Andrew Bynum? First overall pick was Andrew Bogut, who never made an all-star team, but was still a solid player, won a championship in Golden State. David Lee, another all-star player, he did win a championship in Golden State while making a couple all-star teams. Marcin Gortat was a solid player, so a lot of solid players. Monta Ellis, who is easily the best guard Golden State has ever drafted in the last 20 years. This is a class that had 5 all-stars in total. Outside of Chris Paul, who's obviously the best player, not a lot lot of historical star power though, so I'll have to put it a tick below the 04 draft. I'll say it's a B- grade. The 2006 NBA draft had as many all-stars as the 05 and 04 draft classes, but it doesn't really seem to get talked about as much, and I think that has a lot to do with the fact that Andrea Bargnani was the first overall pick. Bargnani was a guy, he was capable of some scoring stretches that were pretty good, but he literally did nothing else. He didn't rebound, pass, or defend, and is considered a draft bust despite the fact that he averaged over 20 points per game in a season. It also doesn't help this class that Brandon Roy had injury issues that cut his career short, but his teammate LaMarcus Aldridge ended up being the best player from this class, although had Brandon Roy stayed healthy, he most likely would have been the best player in the class. This class also produced Kyle Lowry and his fat ass. Pella Millsap had a long career. Lakers head coach J.J. Redick. Rajon Rondo had some famous postseason runs with the Celtics. Rudy Gay, no offense. P.J. Tucker, Cephalosha. I mean, a lot of names, a lot of role player guys, some all-stars. LaMarcus Aldridge might be in the Hall of Fame someday, knowing the NBA Hall of Fame's low standards. But I would say this is, I think it's a C+ grade. I'll give it a C+ grade. A lot of that has to do with the fact that the first overall pick, Bargnani, wasn't that good. The 2007 NBA draft produced 5 all-stars, an MVP, and an all-time great player in Kevin Durant, who was second overall behind the first overall pick, Greg Oden, which is what this draft is always going to be most known for, is the Blazers going with Oden over Durant. Now, we all know about Oden. He played just 82 games for the Blazers and 105 games overall in the NBA because of injuries, while Durant went on to one of the most consequential, and I say that with all due hate, careers for one of the top 10 to 15 players ever. But this draft was more than just Durant. Al Horford has carved out a long career. Mike Conley, Oden's teammate in high school and in college, carved out a long career. Marc Gasol, very good career. Thaddeus Young is like the GOAT role player. Jeff Green, same thing. Joakim Noah had like 1 or 2 years where he was really good. So there were some good pieces to this class, but overall, I would say it fell off pretty quickly after the top 3 or 4 guys. Not a lot of depth, but I think having Kevin Durant, having Al Horford is still going strong, Conley's still going strong. I think this class deserves a B grade. 2008 draft is one of the better drafts of all time. It produced 7 all-stars, including first overall pick Derrick Rose, and 2 MVPs, also including first overall pick Derrick Rose, even though Derrick Rose didn't really deserve his MVP, and he also doesn't know what consent is, by his own admission. The other MVP from this draft, Russell Westbrook, is also the best player in the draft, but there were other very good players, such as Kevin Love, Brook Lopez, Goran Dragic, Serge Ibaka. I'm not going to say George Hill because he missed that free throw at the end of the finals that fucked LeBron over. DeAndre Jordan lasted forever. Gallinari was a very good player. Batum's a good player. JaVale McGee and Roy Hibbert. Roy Hibbert made not 1 but 2 all-star games. What a career he had. So this is a very, very deep class. If not for Rose's injuries that derailed his career, he probably would have had a similar career to Westbrook. So I would say this class gets an A- grade. It has top-level star power and also a lot of depth. 2009 draft class wasn't that much different really from 2008. The first overall pick, Blake Griffin, had a longer, more successful career than Derrick Rose, but he still did deal with injuries, including missing all of what would have been his rookie season in 09-10. The 09 draft produced 6 all-stars and, much like the 08 draft, produced 2 MVPs, including the best player in the draft, Stephen Curry, who is one of the 10 or so best players of all time. The other MVP that this draft produced was James Harden, who is one of the biggest playoff droppers and chokers ever, but still also one of the best players of all time and one of the top 4 shooting guards, combo guards ever. You got Harden, you got Steph. Blake Griffin himself, even though he wasn't at the level of those two, had several very, very good years, all NBA seasons. Drew Holiday is still making an impact. Danny Green was a great role player. Ricky Rubio might not have lived up to the hype, but he still had a good NBA career. DeMar DeRozan's had a long, successful, over 20,000 career point career. Taj Gibson, great role players. This was a class, really, that I think if you're going to compare any class that has a shot with the 03 draft, it would be the 09 draft, honestly. So I would say this draft gets an A grade from me. It has the top-level star power, it has some depth, but it doesn't have the GOAT, which is why it doesn't get an A+. The 2010 NBA draft was a stark fall-off from the successful 08 and 09 versions, and even 07, considering that 07 produced Kevin Durant. No, in 2010, we got John Wall as the first overall pick, and while John Wall had a good career, it was somewhat disappointing and didn't have much playoff success. The best player in the 2010 draft, which produced 4 All-Stars, in my opinion, would be Paul George, although some might say at his peak, DeMarcus Cousins was better. The draft also produced Gordon Hayward, but really not a lot of depth to this draft. Derek Favors, Hassan Whiteside, Greg Monroe, Eric Bledsoe. Again, not a lot of substance substance here, so I would say that this draft class gets a grade of D. 2011 draft class was a bit of a return to form. It produced 7 All-Stars, including first overall pick Kyrie Irving, who is so non-controversial in everything that he does, right? Anyways, this class has depth. You got Kyrie, you got Jimmy Butler, you got Kawhi Leonard, who also doubles as the best player in the draft and is a 2-time Finals MVP. Tobias Harris looks like J. Cole. 4-time champion Klay Thompson, also either the second or third greatest shooter of all time. Enes Kanter, Tristan Thompson was a contributor on the 16 Cavs that won it all. Isaiah Thomas, no, not the Hall of Famer, the other tiny one from the Celtics, had that 1 year where he averaged almost 30 a game. Nikola Vucevic has had a very long, successful career. Jonas Valanciunas, who looks like Travis Kelce. So this is a draft with a lot of depth. Kawhi, if Kawhi had been able to stay healthier, and same thing, Jimmy Butler's another guy like that. Butler and Kawhi are both known for their playoff careers, and actually Kyrie is too. But if those three guys have been able to pick up more regular season accolades, I think this draft class would be ranked a lot higher than it actually is. But this is a sneaky good draft class. I would say this is an A- grade. Moving on to the 2012 NBA draft, another example where the first overall pick and the best player in the draft are one and the same. This was the Anthony Davis draft. Davis had the one and done year at Kentucky where he won the national championship and was a pretty consensus first overall pick. He has gone on to a very successful and Hall of Fame, if not somewhat controversial, career. The class also produced Damian Lillard, Andre Drummond, Draymond Green, Bradley Beal, Chris Middleton, Harrison Barnes. How about Harrison Barnes? Jay Crowder, Evan Fournier. Don't Google that. So there was a lot of good players in this draft. Anthony Davis, Damian Lillard are the top two, and then there's kind of a gap after that. Overall, it produced 6 All-Stars. So I would say overall, I would give it a grade of B+. 2013 NBA draft. Oh boy, the Anthony Bennett draft. Anthony Bennett, the first overall pick. My money is the biggest draft bust in the history of the NBA. Yes, even bigger than Kwame Brown, even bigger than Darko Milicic. He is so bad that he played 4 years and he played for 4 different teams. I used to make a joke saying that I hope that he plays 30 years and I hope that he plays 1 year for every team so every team in the league can understand how terrible he is. Overall, the rest of the draft wasn't that much better. It produced only 3 All-Star players, but it does have one super duper star, and that is Giannis, who was picked 15th overall and at the time appeared to be one of those run-of-the-mill shot in the dark draft picks. And that's what he was. There was like crappy highlights of him playing in a gym somewhere in Greece, so nobody knew that he was going to become a 2-time MVP, a Finals MVP, all that stuff. So there was him. Rudy Gobert is a good player that nobody respects. Steven Adams, respectable career. CJ McCollum, respectable career. Kelly Olynyk, fuck him for dislocating Kevin Love's shoulder. Kentavious Caldwell-Pope, some good role players in here, but really after Giannis, combined with the atrocity of Anthony Bennett being picked first overall, really just a terrible draft, even with Giannis. So I would give this a D- grade. And the only reason it's not an F is because of Giannis. The 2014 NBA draft is interesting because if you would ask somebody a couple years after, let's say in 2017 or 2018, what do you think of the 2014 draft? They'd say, well, it's probably going to be one of the worst drafts of all time. And that's because first of all, the first overall pick, Andrew Wiggins, has had a disappointing career, but he's still a guy that he's teased people with. He's averaged 20 points a game on some bad teams. He was a key contributor on a title run that was a fluke-ass title run by the Warriors in 2022. And he also got like a Mickey Mouse All-Star selection. So the 2014 draft has 5 All-Stars, but it does have 2 MVPs. And both those MVPs started their careers after 2014. Nikola Jokic came to the league a year later in the 15-16 season and didn't really truly break out until around 2019. And then of course Joel Embiid was also picked in 2014, and he missed his first 2 seasons with injuries entirely, missed most of his unofficial rookie season in 2017, and then finally started to get on track. So this was a track where it's 2 best players, it's 2 MVPs. They didn't really develop and become the dominating superstars until a little bit later down the line. And really besides those 2, you got every draft has good players, but there's really no stars, I would say. I guess if you want to consider Julius Randle a star, I don't know. He's one of the worst postseason players ever statistically. I'm looking at the rest of this. These charts, by the way, that you see, these are sorted by career win shares. So Clint Capella, kind of one of those guys. Dwight Powell, they're rim runners. They can kind of game the system. Aaron Gordon's gone on. Kyle Anderson, Jeremy Grant, Marcus Smart. So there's a lot of guys who play valuable roles from 2014, but Jokic and Embiid, specifically Jokic, I think give this draft class a lot more legitimacy. So I'd say this is a B+ grade. The 2015 NBA draft, we got the zestiest first overall pick in recent memory. Karl Anthony Towns went first overall and looked as though early on in his career that he was going to be something special, and and he has ended up having a good career, but I would say an underachieving career. The best player, even though statistically Karl-Anthony Towns is easily the best player, my eye test, and I'm gonna have to give the eye test best player award to Devin Booker, who started out on some really bad Phoenix teams, but kept his head down and kept working, and has gone to a finals and is a much better playoff performer than Karl-Anthony Towns. So he gets the best player from this draft. The draft overall produced 4 All-Stars, no MVPs. A bit of a light draft. Porzingis was in this draft. D'Angelo Russell is one of the All-Stars, and you can hear me laugh because I just think he's just another historically bad player in the postseason. A lot of role players, not a lot of stars. Booker is not even a superstar, I would say. He's a star caliber player. So overall, I would give this a C- grade. The 2016 NBA draft was the Ben Simmons draft. Remember him? Anyway, this draft produced a healthy 6 All-Star players. There was some controversy as to who is the best player in this draft. I went with Domantas Sabonis over Jaylen Brown and Pascal Siakam, just because Sabonis, even though I don't like watching him play, he has been probably the most consistent regular season player and has the biggest volume of work of any of those guys. Although if Jaylen Brown has a monster finals performance and wins a championship and a finals MVP this upcoming week or these next upcoming weeks, that might change. But for now, when this video is being made, Sabonis is the best player, but it also produced Siakam. It also, Ben Simmons is going to go down as one of the biggest underachievers of all time, but it looked like for a minute he was going to be something special after his first couple years, and that never really came to fruition. Malcolm Brogdon's like the worst Rookie of the Year winner ever. Brandon Ingram's another guy, good stats, but not a guy that you probably want to have on your team. DeJounte Murray, another all-star player, solid player. So there's a lot of good players in this draft, just really no super duper stars. And for that, I think I'm going to have to give it a grade of C. 2017 NBA draft will always be known as the Markelle Fultz draft. Now, people, for whatever reason, have been really hesitant to call Markelle Fultz a draft bust, even though he was the first overall pick, and he's been in the league now for 7 years, and he's done shit, really. He's done nothing. What the fuck has he done besides get injured a lot? So Markelle Fultz is one of the biggest draft busts of all time. His time in Philly was obviously a nightmare, but despite the terrible first overall pick, there were also 6 all-star players drafted, and some really good players here, so this class has a lot of depth to it. Jason Tatum, obviously, is probably the best player in the class. It's really close between him and Donovan Mitchell. Again, similar to Jaylen Brown the year before. If Tatum goes out in this final series and has a bonkers finals and wins finals MVP, I would easily, and I'm still going to say he's the best player in this draft class, but he would easily be the choice there. But Donovan Mitchell's had some monster playoff runs. Jared Allen's a very good player. Bam Adebayo for the Heat has done wonders. Lauri Markkanen is a guy, 20 plus per game score easily. De'Aaron Fox has turned out to be a very good player. Josh Hart's a great role player. Anunoby, great role player. Derek White has become good. Like there's a lot of very good, impressive players in this class. Tatum might be considered a superstar by a lot of people. He's not by me, but I think this class has a lot of depth, a lot of versatility to it, so I'm going to give it a grade of B+. 2018 draft class. First overall pick was DeAndre Ayton, which even at the time had some people questioning why the hell are the Suns taking a traditional center who doesn't shoot threes over a guy like Trae Young or especially Luka Doncic. Now, Luka and Trae were traded for each other on draft night, and for a long time people were saying, well, the trade was equal. They aren't saying that any longer because Luka is on all-time great trajectory, and much like Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum, his legacy is impacted big time by what's going to happen over the next 2 weeks in the finals. But Luka already is one of the most decorated players in NBA history, and his statistics are unbelievable. But it's not just Luka. This class produced 5 All-Stars, including Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, who was the MVP runner-up this year. Trae Young, although he's not Luka, is still a formidable offensive player. Jalen Brunson this year had a great career, MVP candidate. Mikal Bridges is a consistent, albeit not superstar level like the other guys. DeAndre Ayton isn't first overall pick. He's probably the worst first overall pick ever, if that makes any sense. Jaren Jackson Jr., one of the best defensive players in the league, although offensively he can be frustrating. Mitchell Robinson, Robert Williams, 2 incredible rim runners, lob threats. So this is a class, a very good draft class. It's one of the few recent draft classes, I believe, that has a chance to really become a historically great draft class in time. That's why, so far, I'm going to give it a grade of A-. The 2019 draft was the Zion Williamson draft after Zion had that historic and unbelievable season at Duke. He went first overall. And after that, though, a little bit of a drop-off. That's because the second overall pick in this draft was Ja Morant, and the battle for best player in this draft is between Zion and Ja. I think there's no question, at least in my mind, when Zion is actually on the court, he's the better player between the two. And we all know Ja has had some off-court problems, but we all know Zion's had some off-court problems as well. well with his weight and being able to stay healthy, but I think Zion is still the best player in this draft, and there really aren't a lot of other players to write home about. There are only 3 all-star players in this draft. The other all-star besides Zion and Ja is Darius Garland, who can be frustrating. When I look at the best players in this draft, I see a lot of rim-running lob threat guys. Daniel Gafford, Nick Claxton, Brandon Clark, Jackson Hayes. Good solitary pieces, but no real game changers. And I gotta be honest, the potential of this draft is still kind of unknown because we don't know how Ja and Zion's careers. They're the 2 best players in this draft, and they're still kind of about how their careers going to turn out. Is Zion going to turn it around? Is he going to be able to stay healthy? And is Ja going to be able to move past all the off-court gun shit? If those 2 guys end up figuring shit out, this draft will have a pretty respectable grade. But as it stands right now, when we're kind of up in the air with those 2, I'm going to have to say this draft class gets a C-. The 2020 NBA draft, aka the COVID draft, has produced 4 all-star players, including that of first overall pick Anthony Edwards. Now, the real question for this draft, at least in my opinion, is who is the best player from this draft? Now, some people might say recency bias is Anthony Edwards. He was named 2nd team All-NBA this year. I decided at the moment that Tyrese Halliburton is still the best player and is slightly better than Anthony Edwards. Halliburton also made 3rd team All-NBA this year, so it's not completely out of left field, although Edwards obviously has the highest potential, and he led the Wolves on that Western Conference Championship run this year. Didn't really play that well in the conference finals, though. LaMelo Ball is also in this draft. When he's been healthy, he's put up good numbers, but there's a question of how much is his style of play. Is it conductive to winning, or are the Hornets just really dog shit? Tyrese Maxey is a guy who's shown incredible improvement. He was the 21st pick. Nobody expected him to be as good as he is. He's another all-star. Desmond Bane, 20-point per game guy. You got some other solid role players, Obi Toppin, Peyton Pritchard, but really the 2020 draft, I say, is if Anthony Edwards continues to improve and becomes an all-time great player, as well as Tyrese Halliburton, if Halliburton can get over his hamstring injuries that he had, he can also improve. You could have 2 guys who are, and again, even LaMelo Ball, so you could have still a relatively fresh draft. You have 2 or 3 guys from this draft who could relatively end up becoming very, very good, and I think we all know Anthony Edwards is going to become an all-time great player, at least if he stays healthy. So I would say this draft gets a grade so far of B-. The 2021 NBA draft. Now we're starting to get into the drafts that are a little bit too recent to fully have a final grade for, but I still think that 2021, I think this is the last year where we can kind of get a grasp on who the best players are and what they're going to be like. Now, this class has produced 1 all-star player. That is Scotty Barnes, who is also the Rookie of the Year. First overall pick was Cade Cunningham. Now, Cade Cunningham is a guy that if you look at his raw stats, I think Cade Cunningham is one of those guys where the advanced stats are never going to like him, and that's because he's inefficient and he turns the ball over a lot, and he's been on terrible Pistons teams. Now, Cade Cunningham fans, it's the chicken or the egg argument. Is the team bad because of him, or is he bad because of the team, or his numbers bad because of the team? I've never been overly impressed watching Cade Cunningham, so I don't really put a lot of stock in him. I'm looking at this class. Evan Mobley was a guy who flashed early, hey, maybe this guy could be something really, really special. Instead, he's basically a slightly better version of Tyson Chandler, which isn't bad, but a little bit disappointing considering the early returns that he showed. Scotty Barnes has a good all-around game, but seems like he's limited in some ways. Franz Wagner seems like he can max out at an all-star caliber level. Herbert Jones is one of the best defenders in the league, but offensively, you got questions. The one player in this draft that has superstar potential that still maybe hasn't shown it all is Alfred Sengun. He maybe could be a poor man's Nikola Jokic if everything turns out correctly. Considering that Jokic is probably one of the 4 or 5 best basketball players of all time, that would mean that Sengun would be a Hall of Famer if he was a poor man's version of Jokic. So I would look out for him. Kuminga is another guy. Obviously, you look down there, Josh Giddey. Oh, we all have I have 15 or so jokes I can make about Josh Giddey. And then Corey Kispert, who is the most handsome man in the NBA probably. But overall, early returns in this draft class, not very promising. I'm going to say it's a D grade. 2022 draft was Paolo Banchero draft. Now, I'm not a big fan of Banchero. He does have an all-star selection. He's the only all-star from this draft, even though it's only been 2 seasons. But I'm not a fan of his. He seems to be a high-volume, mediocre efficiency guy. Not a fan of his game. Jalen Williams could be a star player. Walker Kessler is a very good defender. Keegan Murray is going to have a long career. Jalen Duren's a great rim threat. Chet Holmgren is, to me, the best player from this class, even though I do feel like at times in the postseason, he became a little bit hesitant, and I think he needs to learn how to be on the ball more. But he and Jalen Williams are going to be the reason why OKC is competitive. Obviously, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander as well. But I look at it, and there's some good players here that have flashed really early, but Chet Holmgren is the one that is flashed potential superstar potential, and Jalen Williams is going to be an all-star in short order. So this grade, it's too early to say, but I still think the returns from 2022 are better than what 2021 had to offer. And then finally, we get to the most recent 2023 draft. There haven't been any All-Stars from this draft, but we all know that this draft is always going to be remembered as the Victor Wembanyama draft, and for good reason, because he's the best player in this draft, and he didn't make the All-Star team this year, but there's good money that he's going to make the All-Star team every single year that he's healthy from here on out. He's already an all-defensive player. He is an absolute freak, and for the most part, lived up to a lot of the hype, even though the Spurs were terrible. But yeah, Victor Wembanyama, he is the real deal. The draft also produced Derek Lively, who is one of the most important players on a finals team, Trace Jackson Davis. So a lot of guys who appear like they're going to be good role players, but Wembanyama is the one super duper duper star potential here. So the grade's incomplete, but still I would say you got Wembanyama, and then there's a gap, and then you got Lively, and then there's another gap, and then a bunch of guys who could become good role players. So it's kind of a little bit on the fritz there in terms of how good this draft class could be besides Victor, but it's still a grade of incomplete. But I think Victor is going to have to carry this draft, and maybe he will. Who knows? But again, I'm going to say it's a grade incomplete.